The year was 1982, and the mood inside what remained of the Singer Manufacturing Company's fortress in Elizabeth, New Jersey, was as cold as the December wind rattling off Newark Bay. Less than 1,000 workers filed out of the massive brick complex for the final time, their breath visible in the winter air. Their footsteps echoing through corridors that had once thundered with the sound of 5,000 men and women building the machines that clothed the world. The smell of machine oil and metal dust hung in the air one last time. A century-old perfume that would soon dissipate into memory. The factory that opened in 1872 had been called the largest in the world, devoted to the manufacture of a single product. Now, on December 1st, 1982, it was just another corpse in the graveyard of American manufacturing, another fortress that had believed in its own permanence. The men leaving that day carried with them the knowledge that had been passed from grandfather to father to son, how to heat spring steel so it wouldn't snap in the cold, how to turn maple so the grain wouldn't crack, how to build machines that could survive tornadoes and still sew a straight seam 50 years later. But that knowledge, it turned out, was worthless in a world that had stopped valuing forever. This is the story of how America invented consumer credit, built a global empire on the back of a simple sewing machine, and then watched it collapse under the weight of corporate raiders and foreign competition. It's the story of Isaac Singer, a failed actor who fathered 26 children with 5 different women and cared only about getting rich. It's about Edward Clark, the lawyer who hated Singer but made him wealthy by inventing the installment plan that would eventually consume them both. And it's about 2 fortresses of brick and iron, one in New Jersey, one in Scotland, that armed world wars, employed tens of thousands, and believed they were building something eternal. Before we trace the rise and fall of this American giant, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below. And if you're fascinated by the forgotten industrial empires that built the modern world, subscribe so you don't miss the next story. Now let's go back to the beginning, to a failed actor with a talent for machines and an appetite for scandal. The year was 1811, and in the hamlet of Johnsonville in upstate New York, a German immigrant millwright named Adam Raysinger, who had Americanized his surname to Singer, welcomed his youngest son into a world Isaac would spend his entire life trying to escape. The family was poor. Adam worked with his hands, building water wheels and grain mills in a landscape of dense timber and poorly irrigated soil, where the first road wasn't constructed until 1812 and town meetings approved bounties for wolves and bears killed within the township. When Isaac was 10 years old, his parents divorced, a scandal in a community where such things simply didn't happen. He found himself living with a stepmother, Ruth Benson, whom he despised with the intensity only a displaced child can muster. At 12, he made his decision. He ran away, joining his older brother in Oswego, where he learned the machinist's trade in a cramped workshop that smelled of metal shavings and oil. The boy grew tall, eventually reaching 6 feet 4 inches, towering over most men of his generation. He possessed an exceptional aptitude for understanding how gears meshed and springs compressed, how metal could be shaped and persuaded to perform. But Isaac Singer did not dream of machines. He dreamed of applause, of theater lights, of being someone other than a poor German miller's son. At 19, he married 15-year-old Catherine Maria Haley and had 2 children with her before the theater called louder than fatherhood. He abandoned his family and joined the Baltimore Strolling Players, a troupe of traveling actors who performed Shakespeare in rented halls to audiences who often paid in vegetables rather than cash. Singer adopted the stage name Isaac Merritt and threw himself into the profession with desperate energy. He loved the smell of grease paint, the weight of a costume, the moment when the curtain rose and he could be someone other than a millwright's son. But success eluded him. Year after year, he toured from town to town, barely scraping together enough money to eat, sleeping in cheap boarding houses, performing to half-empty rooms. In 1836, while still legally married to Catherine, he met 18-year-old Marianne Sponsler when his acting troupe performed in her town. They began an affair that would last 25 years and produced 10 children, 2 of whom died at birth. Singer lived with Marianne openly, introducing her as Mrs. Singer to everyone they met, maintaining the fiction of a marriage that didn't legally exist, while his actual wife lived elsewhere with their 2 children, abandoned and forgotten. Between acting engagements, Singer tinkered with mechanical devices, always searching for the invention that would make him wealthy enough to fund his theatrical ambitions. In 1839, he invented a rock drilling machine and sold the patent for $2,000, a substantial sum. He spent every cent of it founding his own acting company, the Merritt Players, with Marianne as his co-star. They toured for 9 years, performing in small towns across the Northeast and Midwest, before going broke and disbanding. Singer was nearly 40 years old, a failed actor with a talent for invention and a quote that would define him. When asked about his rock drill, he had said he didn't give a damn for the invention, that the dimes were what he was after. It was an honest assessment. Singer saw machines as means to an end, tools to generate the money that would let him pursue his real passion. In 1849, he invented a wood carving machine for making the wooden type used by printers and took it to Boston to find buyers. It was there, in a machine shop owned by Orson Phelps, that Singer was asked to look at a broken sewing machine that had been causing problems. At first, he dismissed it as beneath him, a paltry business compared to the grand future he imagined for himself on the stage. But Singer looked at the mechanism and saw inefficiency everywhere. He saw a machine that jammed constantly, that required the fabric to be moved in a circle, that was too delicate for anything beyond parlor demonstrations to wealthy women. He saw a device that was more toy than tool. 11 days later, working day and night in Phelps's shop, he had built something better, something that would accidentally make him more famous than any theatrical performance ever could. Singer's sewing machine incorporated the eye-pointed needle and lock stitch that Elias Howe had patented in 1846, but everything else was Singer's innovation. He used a straight needle moving up and down instead of horizontally, mounted it on an overhanging arm above a horizontal table, allowing the operator to sew any part of a garment, and added a foot treadle that freed both hands to guide the fabric. The result was the first practical domestic sewing machine, a device that could actually be used in a home without constant repair and adjustment. But Singer's machine was worthless without the man who would make it a household name, and in 1849, he found him in the most unlikely of places, a lawyer's office in Cooperstown, New York. Edward Cabot Clark was born on December 19, 1811, just 2 months younger than Singer, but he might as well have come from a different planet. Where Singer was flamboyant and theatrical, chasing women and attention with equal vigor, Clark was conservative and methodical, building systems and studying contracts with the precision of a watchmaker. Where Singer spent money as fast as he acquired it, Clark invested carefully, thinking in terms of decades rather than days. When Singer came to him in 1849 needing help with a patent but having no money to pay legal fees, Clark made a calculation that would change American commerce forever. He took 3/8 of the patent rights in lieu of cash payment, betting his future on a penniless inventor with a sewing machine and a reputation for chaos. It was a gamble that Clark's law partners thought was insane, but Clark saw something others missed. He saw a machine that actually worked, and he saw a market that didn't yet know it needed this device. In 1851, when Elias Howe sued Singer for patent infringement, claiming that Singer's use of the eye-pointed needle and lock stitch violated Howe's earlier patents, it was Clark who defended him in court. They lost. The settlement required Singer to pay Howe $15,000, plus a royalty of $25 per machine sold, a staggering sum that could have bankrupted the fledgling company. That same year, Singer and Clark co-founded I.M. Singer and Company, dividing ownership equally and committing to build a business together. They were partners, but they were not friends. The conservative Edward Clark and the flamboyant Isaac Singer patently hated each other, a mutual disdain that would shape everything that followed. Clark despised Singer's personal life, his multiple families, his theatrical pretensions, his inability to think beyond the next dollar. Singer resented Clark's control, his methodical approach, his refusal to take risks that Singer thought were necessary. They could barely stand to be in the same room together, and eventually They wouldn't have to be. What Clark understood, and what Singer never quite grasped, was that the machine itself was only half the invention. The other half was figuring out how to sell it. In 1856, Clark created something that had never existed in America before. He called it the hire purchase plan, and it was devastatingly simple in concept, but revolutionary in impact. A Singer sewing machine cost $125 at a time when the average American worker earned less than $500 per year. No housewife could afford that sum in cash. The machine might as well have cost $1,000 or $10,000. So Clark offered a different arrangement, $5 down, then $1 a week until the machine was paid for. It was the first American consumer credit system, inspired by tactics that piano sellers had used in Europe, but adapted for the American market and the American customer. The effect was immediate and transformative. Sales tripled within a year. Suddenly, families who could never dream of owning a sewing machine were bringing them home, paying by the week, using them to save money on clothing or even to start small dressmaking businesses that generated income. Clark had invented a way for people to buy what they couldn't afford, and in doing so, he had cracked open a door that would never close again. He had taught America to live on credit. But Clark didn't stop there. He hired female demonstrators to show other women how to use the machines, understanding that women would trust women over male salesmen who didn't know the first thing about sewing. He built an exclusive network of agents who went door to door, demonstrating the machines in living rooms, collecting the weekly payments, building personal relationships with customers. He established showrooms with beautiful displays where women could see the machines in action and imagine them in their own homes. He created a service network with mechanics who could repair machines, understanding that a broken machine was a dissatisfied customer who would never buy another Singer product. And he began building factories overseas, understanding that the future was global and that shipping finished machines from America to Europe and Asia was expensive and slow. In 1867, Singer opened its first foreign factory in Glasgow, Scotland. By the early 1870s, overseas sales exceeded domestic consumption for the first time, a milestone that proved Clark's vision. The company that Isaac Singer had founded was becoming the empire that Edward Clark was building, and the two men could barely stand to be in the same room together. The hatred came to a head in 1860. Mary Ann Sponsler, who had lived with Singer for 24 years, believing herself to be his only partner aside from his long-abandoned legal wife, was riding in her carriage through Manhattan when she spotted Singer in another carriage with a different woman, Mary McGonigal, who worked as a clerk in one of the Singer showrooms. Mary Ann screamed, drawing public attention on a busy street. The scandal exploded across the newspapers. It turned out that Singer actually had 4 families living in Manhattan simultaneously, a total of 16 children, all supported at the same time. He had Mary Ann and their 10 children. He had Mary McGonigal and their 7 children, who used the surname Matthews to hide the connection. He had Kate McGonigal, Mary's sister, with whom he was also having an affair. And somewhere in the background was Catherine, his legal wife, whom he hadn't seen in decades. He was accused of bigamy and adultery in a city where such scandals could destroy reputations and businesses. Edward Clark was horrified, not out of moral outrage. Clark was a practical man who cared little for Singer's personal life, but because he feared it would hurt the business he was building. In 1860, Singer finally divorced Catherine, the wife he had abandoned 30 years earlier. In 1863, the company incorporated as the Singer Manufacturing Company, a formal structure that allowed Clark to make his move. As part of the incorporation agreement, Singer agreed to stay out of executive management. Clark forced him out, keeping Singer as a 40% stockholder, but removing him from any operational role. Singer, wealthy beyond his wildest dreams, but banned from running the company that bore his name, retired to England. There, at age 51, he married 19-year-old Isabelle Eugénie Boyer Somerville, a French woman of extraordinary beauty who was rumored to have been the model for the Statue of Liberty that Frederick Auguste Bartholdi was designing. Together they would have 6 more children between 1863 and 1870. Singer would die in England in 1875 at age 63, leaving a fortune of $13 million to be divided unequally among 20 of his living children. One son, William, who had supported his mother Catherine in the divorce case, received exactly $500, a final insult from a father who never forgave perceived disloyalty. But by the time Singer died, the empire was no longer his. It was Clark's, and Clark needed a fortress to house it. Elizabethport, New Jersey, 1871. The land was flat, marshy, and cheap, 32 acres of vacant ground on the Arthur Kill, the tidal strait separating New Jersey from Staten Island. The site was chosen by Inslee Hopper, a Singer executive who understood geography and logistics with the precision of a military strategist. The Arthur Kill gave access to Newark Bay, and from there to the Atlantic Ocean, crucial for a company whose overseas sales were exploding and whose vision was global. The Central Railroad of New Jersey ran directly past the site, allowing raw materials to arrive by the trainload and finished machines to depart without ever touching a road, without ever incurring the expense and delay of wagon transport. Manhattan was close enough to draw on its skilled workforce of machinists and metalworkers, but far enough away that land was affordable and taxes were reasonable. And New Jersey was hungry for industry, willing to offer favorable terms to any company that would build on this scale and employ this many workers. The small factories Singer had been operating in Manhattan, scattered across Mott Street, Spring, Delancey, and Broome, couldn't keep up with demand. They were cramped, inefficient, separated from each other by miles of city streets. Clark needed something massive, integrated, self-sufficient, something that could produce 10,000 machines a week instead of a few hundred. In 1872, the Singer Manufacturing Company opened what was immediately proclaimed, without exaggeration, the largest factory in the world devoted to the manufacture of a single product. The construction was heavy, permanent, built by men who thought in terms of centuries rather than decades. The main buildings rose 5 stories into the New Jersey sky, 230 feet by 60 feet, fronting a park that Singer would create and maintain for public use, 800 feet by 50 feet along the side street where workers would enter through massive iron gates every morning at dawn. Other buildings, 1,750 feet long, housed the foundry department and forging shops where raw iron was transformed into precision parts. The complex stretched for nearly a mile of building frontage, over 1,000 feet of 5-story construction, 500 feet of 3-story, the remainder in 1- and 2-story workshops for specialized tasks. The smell of the place announced itself from blocks away. Coal smoke from 6 stationary steam engines generating 1,100 horsepower combined, the metallic tang of molten iron from the foundry, where temperatures reached 2,000 degrees. The sharp scent of freshly cut lumber from yards that constantly held millions of feet of maple, oak, and walnut in various stages of drying and preparation. The factory consumed 450 tons of coal every week. An endless procession of coal cars arriving from Pennsylvania mines. It had its own gasworks, producing illuminating gas for the lamps that burned at night when production continued after sunset. It had its own electric plant generating power for the arc welders and electric motors. It had its own telephone system connecting departments. It had its own sewage treatment facility. It had its own fire brigade with dedicated equipment. Railroad tracks crisscrossed the factory yard like veins in a body, connecting buildings, connecting to the Central Railroad, moving raw materials in and finished machines out in a choreographed dance of industrial efficiency that never stopped. The complex was designed to be completely integrated and self-sufficient, the realization of Clark's vision of a factory that depended on nothing it couldn't control. Iron ore arrived at the pig iron yard by the ton and was melted in the foundry. The castings went to the machine shops where they were turned, milled, polished, and finished to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Wood arrived as raw lumber from forests in Michigan and Wisconsin and was dried in kilns for months, then cut to precise dimensions in the sawmill and shaped in the cabinet works by craftsmen who had been building furniture for decades. Every screw, every spring, every bobbin, every piece of decorative decal work was made on site by specialists who did nothing else. The factory didn't just produce sewing machines. It produced the machinery that made the machines, the specialized lathes and milling machines and stamping presses that were then shipped to Singer's other factories around the world. When the first sewing machine rolled off the assembly line in 1872, it carried within it the iron ore from the pig iron yard, the maple from the lumber stacks, the coal-fired steam that drove the presses, and the sweat of men who believed they were building something that would outlast empires. To walk into the Singer factory in the 1880s was to walk into a thunderous, chaotic symphony of American industry at its absolute peak. The floor shook constantly with the rhythmic pounding of massive drop forges that stamped sheet metal into precise shapes, each strike sending vibrations through the building that could be felt in your bones. The air was thick with a blue haze of welding smoke and the sharp metallic tang of ozone created by arc welders working on cast iron parts, a smell that clung to your clothes and stayed in your nose for hours after you left. The heat was oppressive near the foundry, where molten metal glowed orange-white and men worked in leather aprons soaked with sweat, their faces protected by goggles, pouring liquid iron into sand molds with practiced precision. The cold was bitter near the loading docks, where winter wind off Newark Bay penetrated the vast open spaces and froze the sweat on workers' backs. The sound was relentless, overwhelming. The hiss of steam escaping from valves, the clank of metal on metal echoing through the vast space, the whir of leather drive belts connecting hundreds of machines to overhead shaft systems powered by those massive steam engines, the voices of 3,000 workers calling to each other over the noise, trying to coordinate the intricate dance of production. This was not a toy factory. This was not a place where delicate items were gently assembled. This was a cathedral of ballistics, a temple to the religion of precision manufacturing, and the men who worked there understood they were priests of a demanding and unforgiving faith. The workforce in the 1880s numbered around 3,000, growing steadily as demand increased year after year. Fathers trained sons who would train their own sons, passing down tribal knowledge that couldn't be written in any manual or captured in any blueprint. The machinist knew exactly how much heat to apply to spring steel, so it would have the perfect tension without becoming brittle and snapping under use. They knew how to orient maple grain so that a wooden cabinet would resist warping for 50 years in climates ranging from tropical humidity to desert dryness. They knew the sound a properly adjusted machine made when it was running correctly, could diagnose problems by the pitch of a rattle or the rhythm of a knock without even looking at the mechanism. The assembly line workers developed muscle memory that bordered on the supernatural, their hands moving in practiced patterns, fitting parts together with speed and accuracy that seemed impossible to observers. Each worker became a specialist in one small part of the process, fitting the needle bar or adjusting the tension spring or attaching the foot treadle, doing the same operation thousands of times until they could do it in their sleep. By the mid-1880s, the factory was producing 6,000 to 7,000 sewing machines per week, a number that seemed impossible but was achieved through this relentless specialization and obsessive attention to detail. By 1890, the corporation had manufactured over 13 million machines since its incorporation in 1863, and roughly half of those had been built outside of America. Singer was claiming 80% of the world's sewing machine market, and the Elizabeth factory was the beating heart of that dominance, the place where the techniques were perfected and the standards were set. The pride ran deep among the workers. A man assembling machines in Elizabeth knew that the device he put together on Tuesday might be sewing wedding dresses in Paris by Christmas, patching sails on a ship off Singapore by spring, creating school uniforms in Chicago, hemming curtains in Moscow. The machines were built to survive anything. There were stories passed down like legends of Singer machines falling off wagons during transport and continuing to work after being dusted off. Machines caught in barn fires and recovered blackened but functional. Machines surviving floods, outlasting the people who bought them, being passed down through 3 generations of a family. The quality was obsessive because the men building them came from the world of heavy machinery, from foundries and machine tool shops where imperfection meant catastrophic failure, where a weak part could cause an explosion or a collapse. They didn't build the sewing machines like toys or household goods. They built them like tools, like industrial equipment that was expected to function under punishment and abuse. The early machines were stamped from heavy-gauge steel, assembled with real wood for the cabinets and stands, put together by machinists who were used to building things that sat in a cornfield for 50 years and survived tornadoes and hailstorms and the relentless punishment of daily use. When you held a Singer in 1890, you were holding a piece of industrial equipment that had been downsized for domestic use but never dumbed down, never made delicate or fragile. It smelled of machine oil. It had sharp edges that could cut if you weren't careful. It had a foot treadle mechanism that required genuine physical effort to operate. This was the golden age, when the gap between the adult world and the domestic world was narrow, when the tools were the same, just sized differently, when quality meant the same thing whether you were building a factory machine or a household device. The night of May 6th, 1890, Frederick Gilbert Bourne sat in his office on the top floor of the main building, reviewing the accounts and contemplating the empire he had inherited just 1 year earlier, unaware that in 3 hours, most of it would be on fire. Bourne had assumed control of Singer in 1889 after serving as a senior executive, and he had immediately seen problems that his predecessors had ignored or minimized. The facilities were worn and tired, the machinery outdated by newer standards, maintenance deferred to save money. The workforce had grown complacent in their dominance, confident that Singer's market position was unassailable, that they would always have jobs because the company would always dominate. Competitors were beginning to experiment with improvements, with lighter machines that were easier for women to operate, with different stitch patterns that could do decorative work. Bourne was planning a comprehensive modernization program, but he was planning it for next year, after the current production rush ended. At 11 o'clock that night, a watchman making his rounds discovered flames in one of the lumber storage buildings. By the time the New York Times reporter arrived at 1 in the morning, having rushed across the bay after seeing the glow in the sky from Manhattan, the fire was a massive conflagration, visible for miles. The blaze consumed building after building as sparks and burning debris jumped from roof to roof. The fire threatened the entire complex, sent workers and firefighters scrambling through smoke and intense heat, fighting to save what they could. When dawn broke and the damage could be assessed in the gray morning light, the factory was devastated. Buildings had collapsed into smoking ruins. Equipment was destroyed, melted or warped beyond repair. The loss seemed catastrophic, the kind of disaster that destroys companies. But then the accounting revealed something that changed how everyone understood Singer and the empire it had become. Much of the finished stock had survived, machines that were ready to ship protected in warehouses that the fire hadn't reached. More importantly, the company's financial reports showed that by 1890, foreign manufacturing and sales represented the bulk of Singer's cash flow and assets. The temporary loss of the Elizabeth factory barely made a dent in the overall balance sheet. The empire had already moved beyond Elizabeth. The factories in Glasgow and Clydebank in Scotland were operating at full capacity. Factories were planned or already operating in Canada and Austria, in Russia. Singer was no longer an American company with foreign sales. It was a global company that happened to have been founded in America. The fire at Elizabeth was devastating to the workers who saw their workplace burn and feared for their jobs. But to the corporation and its stockholders, it was an inconvenience, a temporary disruption. Bourne seized the opportunity. He rebuilt quickly, hiring the best architects and using the insurance money to upgrade rather than simply replace. He rebuilt with an eye toward efficiency and modernization, installing newer equipment, redesigning workflows, eliminating bottlenecks. He weeded out the workers he considered complacent, promoting younger men who had new ideas. He updated equipment, streamlined processes, implemented new quality controls. Production resumed within months, faster than anyone thought possible. When the last ember cooled and the reconstruction was complete, the men returning to work in the rebuilt factory understood something fundamental had changed. They were no longer building the empire. They were building for an empire that had already moved beyond them, and the center of gravity had shifted to places like Clydebank, Scotland, where an even larger fortress was rising on the banks of the River Clyde. Clydebank, Scotland. 1882. George Ross McKenzie stood on 46 acres of farmland, on the outskirts of Glasgow, and envisioned something larger than anything America had built, something that would eclipse even the massive Elizabeth facility. Mackenzie was a Scot who had emigrated to America in 1846 at age 20, worked his way up through the Singer organization, and risen to vice president, one of the most powerful positions in the company. When Singer needed a foreign manufacturing base to serve the exploding European and Asian markets, Mackenzie had argued passionately for Scotland, for his homeland, and he had the numbers to back up his argument. The reasons were eminently practical. Scotland had established iron industries that had been perfecting their craft for generations, skilled metal workers who understood precision, a deep tradition of precision engineering that came from its world-famous shipbuilding trade on the Clyde. Labor was cheaper than in America, but no less skilled, perhaps even more skilled given the apprenticeship traditions. Glasgow sat on the River Clyde with direct shipping access to Europe, Africa, and Asia, eliminating the need to ship finished machines across the Atlantic before they could be distributed. The site at Kilbowie in Clydebank was perfect. Flat land ideal for construction. Accessible by both rail and water, close to Glasgow's pool of skilled workers, but far enough from the city center that land was affordable. Construction began with the groundbreaking ceremony that Mackenzie personally conducted, turning the first shovel of earth in a ceremony attended by local dignitaries who understood this factory would transform their small town. The builders used over 20 million bricks to create two massive buildings, each 800 feet long, 50 feet wide, 3 stories high initially, connected by 3 wings that formed a unified complex. Rising above the middle wing was the crown jewel, Mackenzie's gift to Clydebank and his statement about Singer's permanence, a 200-foot clock tower with faces 26 feet in diameter, larger than Big Ben in London, larger than any clock in Scotland. Each clock face weighed 5 tons, massive circular structures of cast iron framework supporting the glass and the enormous hands. The hour hand measured 8 feet 9 inches in length. The minute hand stretched 12 feet 8 inches. It took 4 men 15 minutes of hard physical labor to wind the massive mechanism, a task performed twice weekly, every Tuesday and Saturday, for nearly 80 years, without fail. The Singer name was displayed prominently above each clock face, visible for miles around, a declaration of corporate pride and permanence. Sailors on the River Clyde returning from voyages around the world knew they were nearly home when the Singer clock tower appeared on the horizon. The rhythmic pounding of the factory became the heartbeat of the town, the sound that defined daily life, the noise that told you it was morning when the steam whistles blew and workers poured through the gates. The factory was completed in 1885, an astonishing feat of construction and coordination. The workforce numbered 5,000 by year's end, drawn from across Scotland and even from Ireland, men and women desperate for the steady wages that Singer offered. Production began immediately, and the scale was staggering to contemporary observers. With nearly 1 million square feet of manufacturing space and almost 7,000 employees at peak production periods, the factory could produce an average of 13,000 sewing machines per week, making it by far the largest sewing machine factory in the world, surpassing Elizabeth. The Singer name blazed from the clock tower, visible day and night after electric lights were installed in 1928. In 1905, the U.S. Singer Company set up the Singer Manufacturing Company Limited as a UK-registered company, formalizing the Scottish factory's importance and independence. Demand continued to exceed production year after year, so the buildings were extended upward to 6 stories to squeeze out more capacity without expanding the footprint. In 1907, a railway station named Singer Station was built to serve the factory, one of only 2 railway stations in the entire United Kingdom named after a commercial enterprise, a testament to the factory's dominance of the local economy. By the early 1900s, Clydebank had surpassed Elizabeth in production volume, in workforce size, in symbolic importance to the company's global identity. This was not just a factory. It was an industrial nation-state, a monument to permanence, a declaration that Singer would measure time itself and would outlast anything the future could bring. By 1914, the machinists who could shape the delicate mechanisms of a sewing machine, men who could work to tolerances of a few thousandths of an inch, discovered they could just as easily shape the mechanisms of death with the same precision and care. When the Great War erupted in August of 1914, governments on both sides of the Atlantic turned immediately to their precision manufacturers for weapons and ammunition. The logic was simple and undeniable. A man who could cut threads accurate to a thousandth of an inch for a sewing machine. Bobbin assembly could cut the rifling grooves in a gun barrel to the same exacting standards. A factory that could stamp sheet metal into sewing machine housings with perfect reproducibility could stamp shell casings by the thousands with equal precision. A workforce that understood tolerance and fit, that knew how parts needed to work together flawlessly, could build bomb fuses that would detonate reliably and gun mechanisms that wouldn't jam. At Elizabeth, the production lines that had been making domestic sewing machines for housewives were retooled within weeks to produce 75mm cannons for the artillery and 45 caliber automatic pistols for officers. The transformation happened with shocking speed. The drop forges that had been stamping sewing machine parts began stamping gun components, making parts for weapons that would kill men in trenches across France and Belgium. The machinists who had been turning decorative metal trim for cabinet edges began turning barrel blanks and breech mechanisms. The same hands that had assembled machines to help grandmothers mend clothes assembled weapons designed to kill young men in the most efficient manner possible. The duality didn't escape the workers. They understood with uncomfortable clarity that they possessed a transferable skill, a knowledge of precision manufacturing that was morally neutral, that could serve peace or war with equal facility, that didn't care whether it was creating or destroying. When the Second World War arrived in September of 1939, the scale of weapons production dwarfed anything from the Great War. By 1941, the Elizabeth factory employed 5,000 workers and had expanded to 113 acres with 48 buildings containing over 2.6 million square feet of manufacturing space. In June of 1942, as America fully mobilized for total war, the United States government issued a directive that halted all civilian sewing machine production to redirect materials, labor, and factory capacity to the war effort. From June 1942 until July 1945, Elizabethport completely ceased making any domestic sewing machines for the consumer market, though it continued to produce spare parts, industrial needles, and limited runs of industrial machines for garment factories making military uniforms. The factory produced Norden bomb sights, the secret technology that allowed American bombers to hit targets from 20,000 feet. The device that made strategic bombing possible. It produced M1 Carbine, rifle receivers by the tens of thousands, the lightweight weapon that would arm American forces across 2 theaters of war. In 1939, Singer received a production study from the government to draw plans and develop standard raw material sizes for building M1911A1 pistols, the famous Colt 45. The following April, Singer was given an educational order for 500 units with serial numbers S800001 through S800500. The educational order was a special program designed by the Ordnance Board to teach companies without gun-making experience to manufacture weapons to military specifications. Singer delivered all 500 units to exacting standards. Although the company couldn't meet the ambitious requirement of 100 guns per day, the War Department was impressed with the quality of construction and the precision of the work and shifted Singer's production to navigation and targeting equipment instead, recognizing that the company's real strength was in precision mechanisms rather than volume production of firearms. Across the Atlantic, Clydebank faced a more direct and terrifying threat. On the nights of March 13th and 14th, 1941, German bombers targeted the Singer factory and the nearby shipyards in what became known as the Clydebank Blitz. The bombers came in waves throughout both nights, dropping incendiary bombs that set Singer's massive timber yard ablaze in a fire that could be seen from miles away. The fire spread rapidly to nearby buildings as high explosives shattered structures and sent debris flying. Over the 2 horrific nights of bombing, 528 civilians were killed. 39 of them Singer workers who died either in the factory or in their homes nearby. Over 617 people were seriously injured, many of them maimed for life. 35,000 civilians lost their homes, many of them Singer employees who lived in the Clydebank tenements near the plant, walking to work every morning. The factory suffered catastrophic damage, losing 390,000 square feet of floor space to fire and bomb blasts. Entire sections of the complex reduced to rubble and twisted metal. The famous clock tower was badly damaged when incendiary bombs landed on the timber yard directly below it, and the resulting fire raged out of control, the heat cracking the clock faces and warping the metal framework. Yet, incredibly, through sheer determination and round-the-clock effort, the factory was patched up and production returned to pre-Blitz levels within 6 weeks. The clock tower, charred and scarred but still standing, continued to mark time over a town that had been nearly destroyed, a defiant symbol that some things survive even the worst that humans can inflict. When peace returned in 1945 and the machinists went back to threading needles instead of arming bombers, they carried with them the knowledge that precision is precision, that the hands that build can also destroy, and that the fortress they had built was strong enough to serve any master, even death itself. The post-war boom should have been Singer's greatest triumph, the vindication of everything Edward Clark and his successors had built, and for a handful of years, it genuinely was. At Elizabeth, the factory roared back to civilian production with an energy and optimism that seemed unstoppable. Claims exist in various sources of 10,000 sewing machines per day rolling off the assembly lines, though these numbers likely reflect peak production across multiple shifts and may include output from other Singer facilities rather than sustained daily output from Elizabeth alone. Regardless of the exact figures, production was enormous. Employment swelled, with reports of up to 40,000 workers during peak periods when all 3 shifts were running at capacity and temporary workers were brought in to meet demand. The demand seemed insatiable, as if every household in America and Europe simultaneously decided they needed a sewing machine. Every American household wanted the machine their mother or grandmother had used. Every bride wanted a Singer as part of her hope chest. Every woman who had learned to sew during the war years, making do and mending, wanted a machine of her own. The Singer name was synonymous with sewing the way Kleenex meant tissue or Xerox meant copying. It had become a generic term. Sailors in the Pacific had seen Singer sewing machines in villages across Asia, evidence of the brand's global reach. Soldiers returning from Europe had seen the Singer shops on the grand boulevards of Paris and London, seen the machines in use from Italy to Norway. The brand had achieved total global saturation, a recognition that transcended language and culture. Orders flooded in faster than they could be filled. The factory ran 3 shifts around the clock. The prosperity felt permanent, inevitable, as natural as the sunrise. But underneath the impressive production numbers and the crowded factory floors, vulnerabilities were silently accumulating like water behind a dam. European manufacturers like Bernina of Switzerland, Pfaff of Germany, and Viking of Sweden were experimenting with zigzag stitching patterns that allowed decorative work, with lighter construction using new alloys, with features Singer hadn't bothered to develop because it controlled the market so completely. Japanese manufacturers were studying American production techniques with meticulous attention to detail and beginning to make their own machines, applying lessons learned from rebuilding their industrial base after the war's devastation. The market for sewing machines was maturing in ways that weren't immediately obvious. Ready-made clothing was becoming cheaper and more available as mass production techniques improved and international trade expanded, reducing the economic necessity of home sewing. The cultural role of sewing was shifting from an essential survival skill that every woman needed to master into an optional hobby or craft pursuit. Most critically, Singer's management had grown dangerously complacent. Decades of market dominance had created an institutional belief that Singer was unassailable, that the brand name alone would sustain sales forever, that the heavy industrial-grade construction that had always been Singer's pride was what customers would always want and demand. Donald P. Kirscher, who led Singer through much of this critical period, saw the vulnerability in the numbers and made a decision that seemed logical and prudent at the time, but would prove fatal. If sewing machine revenue was plateauing as the market matured, the company needed to diversify into other products and other markets. Before Kircher's aggressive diversification program, 90% of Singer's revenue came from sewing machines and related products. Kircher pushed the company rapidly and forcefully into office equipment, defense contracting, aerospace engineering, computing, data processing, gas meters, electronic devices for aircraft, and a bewildering array of other products. The strategy succeeded in one narrow sense. By the 1960s, Singer was the fifth largest electronic manufacturer in the entire United States, a remarkable transformation. But the diversification came at a terrible cost. It diluted management focus and attention. It spread resources thin across too many products and markets. It transformed Singer from a company that made one thing supremely well, with unmatched expertise and pride, into a sprawling conglomerate that made many things adequately but nothing exceptionally. The sewing machine division, which had built the company's reputation and global brand recognition, became just another business unit competing for attention and investment. No longer the crown jewel, but just another line item on a spreadsheet. The men on the factory floor at Elizabeth could feel the change before the executives in their distant headquarters could see it in the numbers. The orders were still coming in. The machines were still rolling out. The paychecks still arrived. But the rhythm had changed subtly. The tempo had slowed just slightly, like a heart beginning its long, invisible process of failure. There were small signs, fewer overtime shifts. Sections of the factory that used to run 3 shifts now ran 2, workers being reassigned to different departments, maintenance being deferred. The small investments that keep a factory modern and competitive were being delayed or canceled as money flowed to the new diversified divisions that management saw as the future. The enemy did not announce itself with dramatic headlines or boardroom confrontations or any kind of formal declaration. It arrived quietly, almost apologetically, in shipping containers from Osaka and Munich, machines that weighed less, cost less, and operated under a completely different philosophy of manufacturing and design. European manufacturers like Bernina, Pfaff, and Viking had developed sophisticated zigzag stitching capabilities and lighter construction using aluminum and advanced alloys instead of heavy cast iron. Their machines were specifically designed for the modern home, which meant compact enough to store in a closet, quiet enough not to disturb the household, aesthetically pleasing enough to leave out on a table without embarrassment. Japanese manufacturers like Brother and later Janome approached production with a philosophy that seemed almost alien to Singer's engineers and managers. Where Singer optimized relentlessly for permanence, building machines meant to last 50 years or more with minimal maintenance, the Japanese optimized for responsiveness and market adaptation. They updated designs every few years instead of every decade. They targeted specific market segments instead of trying to build one machine for everyone. They accepted shorter product life cycles in exchange for the ability to adapt quickly to changing consumer preferences and emerging trends. They outsourced non-core production to specialized suppliers to keep costs down and remain flexible. They focused on features that appealed to casual sewers and hobbyists rather than professional seamstresses or women who sewed out of economic necessity. The philosophical difference was profound and represented completely incompatible visions of what a sewing machine should be. Singer remained stubbornly committed to heavy metal construction, to machines that required physical strength and coordination to operate, but would survive being dropped downstairs, exposed to humidity and dust, used for hours every day for decades, without breaking. The competitors built machines that were lighter, far easier for women to use without fatigue, required less maintenance and adjustment, and cost significantly less to purchase. Most customers didn't need or want a machine that would last 50 years. They needed one that would last 5 or 10 years and handle occasional repairs, simple clothing alterations, and craft projects. They wanted something that looked modern and didn't require a dedicated sewing room or heavy furniture to support it. The manufacturing yield advantage compounded Singer's problems in ways that were difficult for American executives to accept or understand. By the 1970s, independent studies and quality audits showed that Japanese companies consistently achieved better quality control and higher manufacturing yields than American manufacturers. They weren't just building cheaper machines through low wages. They were building machines with fewer defects per 1,000 units produced. machines that required less warranty service and repair, machines that satisfied customers who then became repeat buyers and brand advocates. Singer's response was too slow, too tentative, hampered by what industry analysts and business school case studies later described as old-fashioned management thinking and antiquated machine tools that should have been replaced a generation earlier. The company had built its manufacturing infrastructure during an era when heavy cast iron construction was not just optimal but necessary when durability meant weight and heft. That infrastructure, all those specialized tools and dies and fixtures and trained workers who knew how to work with traditional materials, had become an albatross around the company's neck. Retooling the entire production system would be enormously expensive, requiring hundreds of millions of dollars in capital investment. Retraining the workforce would take years, not months. Competing on price with the Japanese and Europeans meant abandoning the very qualities, durability, repairability, substantial heft, that Singer believed defined its brand and justified its premium pricing. The global overhead Singer had built during its decades of dominance began to magnify inefficiency when growth slowed and then stopped. Factories in multiple countries, each with their own workforce and specialized equipment and management structure, made perfect sense when Singer could produce and sell machines faster than competitors could copy their designs. They made far less sense when nimble competitors could design a completely new model in 6 months, while Singer's design and tooling process took 2 years from concept to production. Scale, which had been Singer's overwhelming competitive advantage for a century, became Singer's prison, a massive fixed cost structure that couldn't adapt quickly enough to a rapidly changing marketplace. At Clydebank, the decline mirrored Elizabeth's trajectory almost exactly, with the same slow strangulation of employment and hope. The factory that had employed 16,000 workers at its absolute peak in the mid-1960s began announcing compulsory redundancies by the end of that same decade. The workforce dropped to 14,000, then 12,000, then 10,000 as entire departments were eliminated or consolidated. The factory that had been the pride of Scotland, that had survived the Blitz when German bombs tried to destroy it, that had employed 3 and sometimes 4 generations of the same families, was slowly starving from lack of orders. Management blamed overseas competition and unfair trade practices. The unions blamed management's stubborn refusal to invest in modern equipment and new product designs. Both sides were right. Both sides were also powerless to stop what was happening. The machinists in Elizabeth and Clydebank, who had learned to build machines that survived tornadoes and house fires, discovered that survival meant nothing in a market that valued novelty and fashion, that the tribal knowledge of how to heat steel so it wouldn't snap in the cold was worthless when the steel itself had been replaced by aluminum and plastic, and that everything they knew about building things that lasted forever was exactly what made them obsolete and unemployable in the modern economy. Donald P. Kircher looked at the balance sheets in 1958 and made the decision that would ultimately kill the company, though he believed with complete sincerity that he was saving it from obsolescence. His logic was sound by every conventional business metric. The sewing machine market was stagnant in developed countries and saturated in emerging markets. Competitors were eating into market share with cheaper products and more modern designs. The company desperately needed new revenue streams to satisfy shareholders and fund continued operations. So Kircher diversified aggressively and rapidly, transforming the company at a pace that left many employees and middle managers reeling. Singer moved heavily into office equipment, defense electronics, aerospace systems, and a bewildering variety of other products that had little connection to sewing. The company that had once focused obsessively on a single product category became a sprawling conglomerate with operations spanning dozens of disparate industries. Revenue from sewing machines and related products dropped precipitously from 90% of total company revenue to just 35% within a few years. The Singer Company became the 5th largest electronic manufacturer in the United States, a remarkable achievement that was celebrated in the business press. But there was a fundamental problem that Kircher either didn't see or chose to ignore. The board of directors, responding to pressure from Wall Street analysts and institutional shareholders, demanded larger stock dividends rather than increased research and development spending. They wanted immediate returns for shareholders, not long-term investment in future products and capabilities. Kircher tried desperately to balance both demands, to satisfy the board's desire for dividends while also investing in the company's future. He expanded manufacturing operations into Europe, Asia, and Mexico. He invested in computing and data processing technologies that seemed promising. But the bottom line remained stubbornly stagnant despite all the activity. The company's total value increased on paper, but actual profits didn't grow proportionally. The board, dissatisfied with Kircher's inability to deliver the growth they demanded, began looking for new leadership with fresh ideas. Joseph B. Flavin took over as CEO in 1975, brought in specifically to be ruthless where Kircher had been cautious. Flavin was a Columbia Business School graduate with extensive international experience at Xerox, a modern professional manager who thought in terms of quarterly earnings and stock price rather than legacy or tradition. His strategy was ruthless by design. He immediately wrote off slow-paying third-world markets where Singer had built strong brand presence but couldn't collect payment reliably. He sold off the diversified portions of the business that weren't generating adequate returns or that required too much management attention. Most controversially and symbolically, he began a systematic phase-out of the core sewing machine business, the very product that had built the company's name and global reputation. Instead, Flavin focused the company's resources and attention on lucrative military contracts and defense electronics, chasing short-term profitability to satisfy Wall Street analysts and the board of directors. In 1978, he made a decision that shocked longtime employees and sent a clear signal about the company's priorities. He moved Singer's headquarters from its prestigious location in Rockefeller Plaza in New York City to Stamford, Connecticut, eliminating 430 jobs in the process. The symbolism was unmistakable and deliberate. The company was no longer about legacy or history or tradition. It was about quarterly earnings reports and stock price performance, and nothing else mattered. The plant closures began in earnest as Flavin implemented his strategy. At Elizabeth, factory activity dropped off sharply and visibly in the late 1970s and early 1980s. The factory stopped making all but specialized industrial sewing machines for garment manufacturers, abandoning the consumer market entirely. The workforce, which had numbered 5,000 during the war years and remained substantial through the 1950s and 60s, fell below 1,000 workers. Entire buildings stood empty, their machinery idle and gathering dust. In February of 1982, the shutdown was formally announced to the remaining workers and to the community that had built its economy around the factory. The announcement was brief, clinical, delivered without sentiment. On December 1, 1982, exactly 110 years after it had opened with such fanfare and optimism, the Elizabeth factory closed its doors for the final time. It was the last Singer factory in the United States to produce the iconic product, the sewing machine that had built the empire and changed American commerce forever. Across the Atlantic, Clydebank's fate was sealed even earlier, the death coming before Elizabeth's. On October 12, 1979, Singer announced with what the press release called Quote 1 that the Kilbowie factory would close permanently by June of 1980. The reasons given were the same litany that had been recited at Elizabeth: increased competition from lower-cost manufacturers, slow response to technological change, the burden of 180 years of accumulated plant and property that required constant maintenance. The closure devastated the community in ways that went far beyond simple unemployment statistics. This wasn't just about jobs or paychecks. It was about identity, about what it meant to be from Clydebank. Families had worked at Singer for 3 consecutive generations, grandfathers training sons in the same skills on the same factory floor. The factory had survived the Blitz when German bombs had tried to destroy it. It had clothed armies and dressed brides and employed thousands upon thousands. But it couldn't survive the accountants with their spreadsheets and their calculations of return on investment. Before the Clydebank factory closed for good, management made one final symbolic decision that revealed how little they understood or cared about what the factory meant to the people who had built it. On March 15, 1963, 17 years before the final closure, at precisely 5 o'clock in the afternoon, Provost F. Downey of Clydebank pressed a ceremonial button that stopped the Singer clock for the last time. The enormous hands ceased their movement. Workers stopped and watched in silence. In the following weeks, the clock tower was systematically demolished as part of what management called a modernization program that would supposedly make the factory more efficient and competitive. The demolition crews used explosives and heavy equipment to bring down the 200-foot tower that had stood for 78 years. The massive aluminum hands that had required 4 men to wind them, the hands that weighed hundreds of pounds each, were cut down and melted in a foundry to create souvenir ashtrays for executives and local politicians. A 5-ton timepiece that had survived German bombs reduced to desk novelties. The tower that had been visible for miles, that had been the largest four-faced clock in the world, that had guided sailors on the Clyde home from their voyages and marked time for an entire town for nearly 8 decades, fell to make room for more efficient factory layouts and production configurations that would never actually be built. When the clock tower in Clydebank fell in 1963, the workers who had faithfully wound that clock twice a week for their entire careers understood with terrible clarity that something more than a tower had been demolished. It was the death of the symbol before the death of the thing itself, and everyone knew exactly what it meant and what would follow. His name was Paul Bilzerian, and he was exactly the kind of man that Edward Clark, the principled lawyer who had built the Singer empire, would have loathed with every fiber of his being. A corporate raider who saw companies not as living organisms to be nurtured and grown, but as carcasses to be stripped of anything valuable before being discarded. In July of 1987, Singer announced a devastating $20 million quarterly loss, blaming runaway development costs for aerospace products that had failed to generate the anticipated returns. In September of that same year, Joseph Flavin died unexpectedly at age 58 from a heart attack, leaving the company suddenly without strong leadership to fight off the predators who were already circling. In October, through legally mandated Securities and Exchange Commission disclosures that companies must file when large stock positions are accumulated, it came to light that a group of investors led by Bilzerian had purchased 2.1 million Singer shares in the preceding 2 months, a significant stake that suggested hostile intentions. Bilzerian was a Tampa-based corporate raider with an established history of hostile takeover attempts and greenmail operations. He had made tens of millions of dollars in previous raids on companies like Cluett Peabody and Hammermill Paper, often through the practice of greenmail, buying enough shares to credibly threaten a hostile takeover, then selling those shares back to the terrified company at a substantial premium to simply go away and leave them alone. In November of 1987, Bilzerian launched an unsolicited $1.08 billion bid to acquire Singer outright. The timing seemed impossibly fortunate for Bilzerian and catastrophic for Singer. On October 19, 1987, Black Monday crashed the stock market in the worst single-day decline since the Great Depression, spooking institutional investors and potential white knights who might have mounted competing bids to rescue Singer from Bilzerian's grasp. Singer's management searched desperately for a white knight, for another company or investor group that would make a competing offer and save the company from being dismembered. But none appeared. The company had already moved its headquarters from Connecticut to New Jersey specifically to take advantage of anti-takeover laws that New Jersey had enacted, but the legal protections weren't strong enough to stop a determined raider with sufficient financing. In January of 1988, T. Boone Pickens, another famous and notorious corporate raider, provided Bilzerian with $150 million in additional financing at a usurious interest rate of 17.5%. That infusion of cash allowed the Singer deal to go through despite the market turmoil. By February of 1988, Bilzerian had secured roughly 90% of Singer's 21 million outstanding shares for a total cost of approximately $1.06 billion in equity, plus the assumption of massive existing debt. He became chairman and chief executive officer, moving into Singer's Stamford, Connecticut headquarters and immediately beginning to implement his plan. The debt structure he had created to finance the takeover was staggering and ultimately unsustainable. $150 million from Mesa Holdings, Boone Pickens' investment group, at 17.5% annual interest, $355 million from Shearson Lehman Holdings, $540 million from a banking syndicate led by National Westminster Bank, Another $450 million in revolving credit from Nova Scotian and West German banks arranged to refinance Singer's existing debt and provide working capital. The company now carried over $1 billion in total debt, and Bilzerian immediately began selling valuable assets to service the crushing debt load and extract cash. Despite initial promises to employees and to the press that he would not strip the company of its core assets, he put Singer's profitable military electronics division up for sale within months of taking control. Prime assets began to disappear, sold to the highest bidder. The business that had once employed tens of thousands making sewing machines that changed the world was being systematically carved up and sold, piece by piece, to pay the debt that Bilzerian had incurred to buy it. A perfect example of financial engineering destroying an industrial company. In May of 1988, barely 3 months after Bilzerian took control, the Securities and Exchange Commission began a formal investigation into Bilzerian's dealings, specifically whether investment groups he controlled had illegally concealed the full extent of their stock holdings in companies they targeted for takeover. In December of 1988, Bilzerian was indicted by a federal grand jury on multiple charges unrelated to the Singer acquisition, but which would ultimately destroy his ability to control the company. In May of 1989, after a trial that revealed extensive financial manipulation and fraud, he was convicted on 9 separate felony counts: securities fraud, tax violations, making false statements to federal regulators, criminal conspiracy, and various securities law violations. In June of 1989, facing certain imprisonment, he resigned as Singer chairman under pressure from the board and prosecutors. On September 27, 1989, he was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison and ordered to pay a $1.5 million fine. The judge, in passing sentence from the bench, looked directly at Bilzerian and said with evident disgust, Quote 2, a remarkable statement for a federal judge to make about a defendant. By the time Bilzerian was led away in handcuffs to begin his prison sentence, Singer was a hollowed-out shell of a company, a name on corporate stationery attached to a mountain of unpayable debt and a thick portfolio of lawsuits from various parties. Former employees filed class action suits over pension benefits that had been promised but never properly funded. Stockholders sued over what they claimed were fraudulent dealings during Bilzerian's takeover and asset stripping. Buyers of various divisions claimed that they'd been systematically overcharged or sold defective assets. The federal government sought $231 million in treble damages for Defense Department overcharges dating back to 1980, claiming Singer had been systematically billing the government for inflated costs. The company filed for bankruptcy protection in 1999, unable to service its debt or defend against the mounting lawsuits. As of 2024, Bilzerian still owes the Securities and Exchange Commission $180 million with accumulated interest, a debt he has spent decades trying to avoid paying through various legal maneuvers and shell companies. And the fortress in Elizabeth where it all began stood empty and deteriorating, its windows broken by vandals and weather, its machines silent and rusting, waiting for the wrecking crews that would never quite finish the job of erasing it from the landscape. The Elizabeth factory did not die quickly or cleanly, or with any dignity. For decades after the last shift ended on December 1, 1982, after the final worker punched out and walked through the gates for the last time, the massive brick complex stood as a silent, hulking tombstone in the center of town. A constant reminder of what had been lost. It was not a clean death with closure and moving on. The windows, once bright with the light of arc welders and the glow of thousands of incandescent bulbs illuminating the night shifts, were systematically shattered by vandals and weather, leaving jagged teeth of broken glass catching the sunlight. The roof, which had sheltered the birth of millions of machines that clothed continents and armed world wars, began to sag dangerously under the accumulated weight of 40 New Jersey winters, leaking water onto floors where master machinists had once stood with pride. To the locals who remained in Elizabeth, the building became haunted, not by spirits in white sheets from ghost stories, but by the heavier, more oppressive ghosts of a lost way of life and vanished prosperity. If you walked past the chain-link fence on a quiet afternoon, if you stopped and listened carefully, You could almost hear the phantom rhythm of the drop forges pounding, almost smell the phantom scent of ozone and machine oil and coal smoke that had defined the place for a century. The factory's closure had devastated Elizabeth in ways that compounded over the following decades. The influx of drugs and crime in the 1970s and 80s wasn't directly caused by Singer's collapse, but the closure fragmented the financial basis of city routines, disrupted a major fiscal resource for the entire city's tax base, and left thousands of able and willing workers suddenly jobless with few transferable skills. Religious leaders and Congressman Matthew Rinaldo met regularly with Singer managers throughout the late 1970s, desperately trying to find ways to sustain the old corporate connection and prevent the closure. But there was nothing to save. The economics were implacable. After 1982, city officials were forced to become reactive rather than proactive, scrambling for any resources wherever they could find them, dealing with the cascading consequences of economic devastation they had no power to prevent or reverse. The building was eventually converted to smaller industrial units, carved up and rented to small businesses and warehouse operations that had no connection whatsoever to Singer's history or legacy. On January 5, 2024, over 40 years after the factory closed, a massive four-alarm fire broke out in one of the old buildings in the complex. A passerby reported seeing smoke and flames at 5:30 in the morning while driving past on their way to work. Over 100 firefighters from Elizabeth and surrounding communities battled the fire throughout the morning. 2 roofs collapsed with thunderous crashes. 1 exterior wall came down, sending bricks crashing into the street. Mayor J. Christian Bolwage assured reporters at the scene that the iconic portion of the building, whatever that meant in the context of an abandoned industrial ruin, was not directly threatened by the flames. The fire burned for hours, thick black smoke visible across Newark Bay in Manhattan, a final ghostly echo of the 1890 fire that had once seemed like the end of Singer, but had only been a pause before an even greater expansion. This time, there would be no rebuilding, no modernization, no triumphant return to glory. The fortress was finally dying its slow death, piece by piece, fire by fire, collapse by collapse, returning to the earth. Across the Atlantic, Clydebank's fate was more definitive and final. The entire factory complex was systematically demolished in the late 1990s, erased from the landscape as completely as if it had never existed. The Scottish Development Agency purchased the entire Kilbowie site and cleared every building to make way for the optimistically named Clydebank Business Park. Companies were offered substantial financial inducements and tax breaks to set up operations or relocate there. Singer itself provided one of the first tenants in a piece of bitter irony, an engineer's office employing exactly 6 people, where once 16,000 had worked in deafening noise and constant motion. The clock tower, which had been demolished in 1963, was commemorated decades later with a sculpture by artist Elspeth Benny, a metal artwork featuring stylized clock hands and decorative panels adorned with the gold RAF decal that had once graced the black enamel Singer machines during the war years. The Singer Station Railway still operates, carrying commuters to modern office parks, one of only 2 railway stations in the entire United Kingdom, named after a factory, serving passengers who have no memory whatsoever of the thunderous facility that once justified its existence. West Dunbartonshire Council maintains a Singer sewing machine collection, officially recognized as a collection of national significance by Museums Galleries Scotland, carefully preserving artifacts and documents from a factory that no longer exists for a generation that never knew it was there. The brand survived the corporate collapse, but only as a ghost of what it had been, a name divorced from any real substance. In 1999, Singer NV filed for bankruptcy protection, overwhelmed by debt and lawsuits. It was acquired by Kohlberg and Company, a private equity firm specializing in distressed assets. In 1997, all remaining U.S. manufacturing operations moved to Laverne, Tennessee, abandoning the Northeast entirely. In 2006, Kohlberg acquired the Husqvarna and Pfaff brands, historic European competitors, and merged them into what became the SVP Group, a holding company for legacy sewing machine brands. The Singer name still appears on sewing machines sold in big box stores and discount retailers around the world. Under ownership that passed through Hong Kong businessman James Ting and eventually to the SVP Group, Singer has recaptured approximately 40% of the world market share for sewing machines, an impressive number that obscures everything that has changed. But the company that exists today has fundamentally transitioned from system builder to brand steward. It maintains brand recognition and market share without clear direction or innovation. The machines it sells today are manufactured overseas, primarily in China and other Asian countries with low labor costs. They are light, made almost entirely of plastic and thin aluminum. They cost between $100 and $300 retail. They are explicitly designed to be replaced rather than repaired when they break. They bear absolutely no resemblance in construction, philosophy, or quality to the heavy industrial-grade machines that came out of Elizabeth and Clydebank, machines that weighed enough to feel genuinely substantial in your hands, that were built by machinists who measured tolerance in thousandths of an inch, that smelled of machine oil and grease, and that were expected to survive for multiple generations with minimal maintenance. The story that began with Isaac Singer, a failed actor who fathered 26 children with 5 different women and cared only about getting rich and famous, ends in a weed-choked parking lot in New Jersey and a generic business park in Scotland. Singer died in 1875 in England, leaving a fortune of $13 million to be divided unequally among his surviving children, according to his whims and grudges. Edward Clark, the quiet lawyer who actually built the empire by inventing consumer credit and understanding what Singer never could, died in 1882, leaving a fortune of $25 million that would fund generations of art collectors and philanthropists and establish one of the great American family dynasties. The installment plan that Clark created in 1856, the revolutionary $5 down and $1 a week that made sewing machines accessible to families who couldn't afford to pay cash, became the template for the entire consumer credit industry that would eventually consume the company he built. From Clark's hire purchase plan came department store credit accounts, then general credit cards, then buy now, pay later schemes and payday loans, and all the mechanisms of consumer debt that now fuel entire sectors of the global economy. The irony is complete and perfect. Clark invented the future of American commerce, and that future eventually ate his company alive. The fortress Singer built in Elizabeth was called the largest factory in the world, devoted to the manufacture of a single product, and the claim was true. It employed 5,000 workers at its peak. It produced machines at a claimed rate of 10,000 per day during the post-war boom. It armed 2 world wars with precision weapons. It survived the catastrophic fire of 1890. It trained generations of machinists who passed down knowledge that couldn't be written in any manual or captured in any blueprint. And then it closed on December 1st, 1982, because Japanese companies could build lighter machines faster and cheaper, because corporate raiders could profit more from debt and destruction than from building and creating. Because permanence had become a liability in a world that valued quarterly earnings over generational legacy. The Clydebank factory, with its magnificent 200-foot clock tower, with its 16,000 workers, with its production capacity of 13,000 machines per week, closed in June of 1980. The clock that had survived the Blitz and German bombs was demolished in peacetime by corporate accountants. The hands that had weighed 5 tons and required 4 men to wind twice weekly were melted into ashtrays, souvenirs of a time when companies built things to measure centuries. Walk past the Elizabeth Industrial Park today, past the chain-link fences topped with barbed wire and the small businesses renting space in the converted buildings, and you won't see the empire that once stood there. But it's there in every installment plan, every credit card statement, every buy now, pay later button on every website that lets you purchase what you can't afford and worry about payment later. It's there in the deliberate lightness of modern appliances, designed to be replaced every few years instead of lasting for generations. It's there in the abandoned factories scattered across the Rust Belt like tombstones. In the small towns that lost their industrial anchors and never recovered, in the workers who discovered that lifetime employment meant absolutely nothing when the company decided quarterly profits mattered more than history or loyalty. It's there in the shift to Chinese manufacturing, The relentless outsourcing of production, the corporate raiders who learned they could get rich by destroying companies rather than building them, the vintage Singer machines, the heavy cast iron models from the 1890s and early 1900s, are now actively sought by collectors and serious quilters who understand that something made to last forever has become valuable precisely because nothing is made that way anymore. The wind still blows through the lot where the Elizabeth factory once stood, kicking up dust and debris in the empty space where the blast furnaces once roared, where the drop forges pounded metal into precise shapes, where men who believed deeply in permanence stamped steel that was meant to last 100 years or more. But the air is silent now, empty of industry. The sharp, distinctive sound of a sewing machine needle puncturing fabric thousands of times per minute, the hiss of steam escaping from valves, the thunder of American industry at its absolute peak. All of it has faded away completely, replaced by the quiet hum of global commerce, where nothing is built to last and everything is built to be replaced. The Singer Empire taught the world how to buy what it couldn't afford, how to pay for the future with debt borrowed from that same future, how to value convenience and disposability over permanence and quality. In the end, that lesson destroyed the teacher. The fortress that Isaac Singer built, while caring only about the dimes, that Edward Clark perfected while inventing the consumer credit system that would eventually consume it, stands as a ruin now, a monument to the precise moment when American manufacturing stopped believing in forever and started believing in quarterly earnings, when the weight of iron became a burden instead of a virtue, when the knowledge of how to build things that survive tornadoes became worthless in a market that valued planned obsolescence over durability. The machines are gone, the workers are gone, the factories are gone. All that remains is the lesson, and the lesson is this: permanence is a lie that humans tell themselves. Empire is temporary no matter how permanent it seems, and everything built by human hands will eventually return to dust.